The arrival of F-16 Fighting Falcons in Ukrainian airspace has not only altered the battlefield dynamics, but has also rewritten modern aerial warfare doctrine in real time. The aircraft, long considered the workhorse of Western air forces, has been unexpectedly transformed into a symbol of defiance, innovation, and battlefield adaptability, as Ukrainian pilots execute maneuvers and tactics that have left military analysts scrambling to update their strategies. Even seasoned U.S. Air Force veterans, who have spent their careers flying these fourth-generation jets, are reassessing everything they believed about the Falcon's capabilities in contested airspace. The journey to the battlefield. How Ukraine secured the F-16. The F-16s did not appear overnight. Their arrival in Ukrainian skies marked the culmination of months of intense political wrangling, delicate diplomatic negotiations, and high-speed pilot training programs. When Kyiv first requested Western fighters in the early months of the conflict, many NATO officials hesitated, fearing that the move would escalate tensions with Russia and provoke an even greater response from the Kremlin. Yet, as Ukrainian pilots continued to press their case, arguing that superior air power was the missing key to breaking through Russia's fortified positions and achieving strategic dominance, attitudes began to shift. By mid-2023, several NATO allies, led by the Netherlands, Denmark, and Belgium, pledged to transfer dozens of F-16s to Ukraine. Simultaneously, Ukrainian pilots were sent to intensive crash course training programs in Europe and the United States, learning to operate the aircraft in mere months, a process that normally takes years in peacetime. When the first batch of F-16s touched down at undisclosed Ukrainian air bases, most military analysts predicted a cautious approach, expecting that Kyiv would use the jets primarily for precision strikes deep behind friendly lines, avoiding direct engagements with Russia's more advanced Su-35s, Su-57s, and heavily fortified air defense networks. However, what actually unfolded stunned the world. Defying expectations. The audacious tactics of Ukrainian F-16 pilots. Rather than staying on the defensive, Ukrainian pilots launched into action with a fearlessness that caught Russian commanders off guard. Instead of treating their newly acquired F-16s as fragile assets to be safeguarded, they pushed them beyond their theoretical limits, flying dangerously close to contested airspace and adopting aggressive new tactics that Western air forces had never envisioned. 1. Suppression of enemy air defenses, SCAD, in disputed skies. One of the most remarkable aspects of Ukraine's F-16 strategy has been its role in CD, suppression of enemy air defenses operations, a job typically reserved for highly specialized aircraft like the EA-18G Growler. Ukrainian pilots working in coordination with ground-based intelligence teams began using their F-16s as bait, luring Russian S-300 and S-400 air defense systems into revealing their positions before launching retaliatory strikes using AGM-88 HARM missiles. This cat-and-mouse approach forced Russian air defense operators to constantly relocate and rethink their deployment strategies, reducing their overall effectiveness and exposing previously concealed missile batteries to drone and artillery strikes. 2. Dogfights with Russian air superiority. Fighters' military planners initially doubted whether Ukraine's F-16s would be able to hold their own against Russia's more modern airframes, such as the Su-35 Flanker E and Su-57 Felon, both of which boast superior radar capabilities and missile ranges. Yet, through a combination of clever engagement strategies, electronic warfare, and teamwork, Ukrainian pilots have managed to level the playing field. Ambush tactics. Instead of engaging in traditional beyond visual range (BVR) combat, where Russian fighters would have the advantage, Ukrainian F-16s have been using low-altitude terrain masking to get closer before launching missiles, reducing Russia's ability to react in time. Electronic warfare support. With NATO-provided jamming pods and AWACS, Airborne Early Warning and Control, intelligence, Ukraine has successfully disrupted Russian radar locking capabilities, allowing its pilots to get in and out of dogfights unscathed. Missile superiority in close range. While Russia's R-77 and R-37M missiles offer an advantage in long-range combat, Ukrainian pilots have excelled in medium and close-range fights using AIM-120 AMRAAMs, missiles with proven kill rates in numerous conflicts. Third, kamikaze-style deep strikes behind enemy lines. In a surprising development, Ukrainian pilots have conducted deep penetration strikes into Russian-held territories, targeting logistics hubs, ammunition depots, and key command centers. These high-risk, high-reward operations involve flying at treetop level to evade Russian radar, launching precision-guided munitions, and escaping at supersonic speeds before enemy defenses can react. This boldness has forced Russian generals to relocate critical infrastructure further from the front lines, creating logistical nightmares that slow down Russia's war machine. The broader implications: shifting the balance of power. Ukraine's successful deployment of the F-16 has ripple effects far beyond its own borders. 1. The end of Russian air dominance. Before the arrival of Western jets, Russia's vast fleet of warplanes enjoyed a significant advantage over Ukraine's aging MiG-29s and Su-27s. But now, with F-16s flying sorties daily, that dominance has been severely challenged. 2. NATO's new strategy. Lessons from Ukraine. The way Ukrainian pilots have utilized F-16s has forced NATO to rethink its air combat strategies. Western planners are now reassessing fourth-generation fighter capabilities, recognizing that ingenuity and battlefield adaptation can offset technological disadvantages. The geopolitical domino effect. The success of Ukraine's F-16 campaign has also sent shockwaves through the global defense industry. Countries like Taiwan, South Korea, and Poland, which rely on F-16s to counter potential threats, are closely studying Ukraine's tactics, knowing they might have to apply similar strategies in future conflicts. What comes next? The future of aerial warfare in Ukraine. While Ukraine's F-16 squadrons have achieved remarkable victories, the war is far from over. Russian forces are likely adapting, upgrading their air defenses, and developing new countermeasures. Additionally, Ukraine still lacks a complete air dominance infrastructure, such as dedicated electronic warfare aircraft, AWACS platforms, and additional munitions stockpiles. However, one thing is certain: the arrival of F-16s in Ukraine has fundamentally altered the course of the war. No longer just Cold War relics, these jets have become symbols of defiance, ingenuity, and relentless resistance. For the world's military strategists, the war in Ukraine has offered a harsh but invaluable lesson. Raw firepower is no longer the ultimate decider of aerial combat. Adaptability, tactics, and sheer willpower are just as important. As the war drags on, the real question remains: will Ukraine's F-16 pilots continue to defy the odds, or will Russia find a way to counter their growing dominance? The answer could shape the future of warfare for decades to come. The F-16 revolution in Ukraine, aerial warfare redefined. The transformation of Ukraine's air combat strategy began almost immediately after the first F-16 Fighting Falcons became operational in Ukrainian hands. What was expected to be a gradual integration of Western air power into the conflict instead became a lightning-fast adaptation that stunned military observers worldwide. Rather than employing these jets in a limited standoff missile platform role, as many NATO planners had envisioned, Ukraine's battle-hardened flight commanders took a radically different approach. These commanders, many of whom had cut their teeth flying Soviet-era MiG-29s and Su-27s in the early days of the war, understood the unique realities of aerial combat against the Russian Air Force. Drawing from their deep knowledge of both Russian air defense systems and combat aircraft, they rewrote the rules of engagement, executing some of the most daring aerial operations in modern warfare. The result? A high-risk, high-reward combat doctrine that has not only allowed Ukraine to challenge Russia's overwhelming numerical advantage in the skies, but also to score victories in situations where Western analysts previously believed survival was impossible. Breaking the mold: the rise of Ukrainian F-16 deep penetration missions. In a complete break from conventional NATO doctrine, Ukrainian F-16 pilots rejected the cautious approach of high-altitude, standoff missile attacks and instead opted for low-level, high-speed penetration missions deep into Russian-controlled territory. These weren't the safe, long-range strikes favored by Western air forces, which rely on AWACS, airborne warning and control systems, electronic warfare jamming, and layered missile defense networks. Instead, Ukraine's pilots employed a blend of Cold War-era Soviet dogfighting instincts and 21st-century Western technology, creating an unorthodox yet lethal combat strategy. Tactical innovation: how Ukraine's F-16s are penetrating Russian defenses. 1. Terrain masking and electronic warfare, slipping past Russian radars. Russian air defense networks, including the highly sophisticated S-300, S-400, and Panzer missile systems, were designed to detect and neutralize high-altitude threats long before they reached Russian positions. However, Ukraine's pilots turned this strength into a weakness by flying at treetop level, using natural terrain features like mountains, forests, and urban environments to block Russian radar signals. Additionally, advanced NATO supplied electronic warfare pods mounted on the F-16s provided jamming capabilities, disrupting Russian radar locking systems long enough for the jets to slip past undetected. This tactic forced Russian air defense operators to constantly relocate and recalibrate their systems, creating gaps in their protective network. 2. High-speed, low-level strikes on Russian ground assets. The first major test of Ukraine's new F-16 doctrine came in a series of daring raids on Russian-held airfields, logistics hubs, and command centers. Rather than launching missiles from a distance, F-16s flew directly into contested zones, dropping precision-guided bombs on critical infrastructure before engaging afterburners to escape before Russian fighters could intercept them. One such high-profile raid targeted a Russian S-400 missile battery near Crimea, a system that had previously been considered nearly impervious to attack. Using a combination of AGM-88 HARM missiles to blind the radar and terrain-hugging flight paths, Ukrainian pilots eliminated the Russian battery before escaping at supersonic speeds. 3. Turning the tables: engaging Russian air superiority fighters in combat. The most shocking development in Ukraine's F-16 campaign has been its decision to directly challenge Russia's vaunted air superiority fighters, including the Su-35 Flanker E and the fifth-generation Su-57 Felon, in dogfights over contested airspace. Before the arrival of the F-16s, Russian forces had used long-range missiles and superior radar systems to dominate Ukraine's aging MiG-29 and Su-27 fleets. Many analysts believed that even with F-16s, Ukraine would continue to avoid direct aerial combat against Russia's technologically advanced fighter jets. But Ukrainian pilots had other ideas. Rather than engaging in traditional beyond visual range combat, BVR, where Russia's longer-range R-77 and R-37M missiles would give it the upper hand, Ukrainian F-16 pilots forced close-range engagements, leveraging their jets' superior maneuverability and Western air-to-air missile technology. Fourth NATO missiles versus Russian fighters, a game-changer. AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles. The introduction of AIM-120, Advanced Medium Range, Air-to-Air Missiles, AMRAAMs, fundamentally changed the balance of air power in Ukraine's favor. While Russian R-77 and R-37M missiles have longer range, they struggle in medium to close combat, an area where AMRAAMs have a far superior hit probability. By forcing close-range fights, Ukrainian pilots neutralized Russia's standoff missile advantage using better targeting systems and faster missile lock-on speeds to score kills. Stealth versus adaptability. Russia's Su-57 Felon, touted as a fifth-generation stealth fighter, was designed for beyond visual range engagements. However, in close combat, its stealth capabilities offer little advantage, allowing Ukrainian F-16s to hold their own in dogfights. Fifth, Russian adaptations and escalating countermeasures. Russia has not remained idle in response to Ukraine's F-16-driven resurgence. Increased deployment of Su-35 squadrons. Moscow has begun relocating more Su-35s and Su-30SM fighters closer to the front lines, attempting to reassert air dominance over contested zones. Expanding air defense networks. Russian forces have moved additional S-400 and Panzer missile batteries into Ukraine's eastern and southern regions, trying to plug the gaps that Ukraine's low-level F-16 flights have exploited. Use of AWACS and drone swarms. Russia has intensified the use of A-50 AWACS early warning aircraft to track Ukrainian movements and has experimented with deploying drone swarms to lure F-16s into kill zones. However, despite these countermeasures, Ukraine's F-16 pilots continue to push the limits of their aircraft, forcing Russian forces into reactive strategies rather than dictating the pace of the air war. The global implications. How Ukraine's F-16 tactics are changing military doctrine. The battlefield innovations pioneered by Ukraine's F-16 pilots are already reshaping military doctrine worldwide. 1. NATO reassessment. Western air forces are studying Ukraine's use of fourth-generation jets in modern high-tech warfare, realizing that adaptability and tactics can overcome technological disadvantages. 2. Lessons for Taiwan and Eastern Europe. Taiwan, facing a potential war with China's advanced J-20 stealth fighters, is analyzing Ukraine's dogfighting success against superior Russian aircraft as a potential playbook for defending its own airspace. Third shift in air combat. Thinking. For years, many strategists believed that older fourth-generation jets like the F-16 were obsolete against modern air defense systems. Ukraine's innovations prove that pilot skill, tactics, and munitions quality still matter as much as raw technology. As the war continues, the biggest question remains: can Ukraine's F-16 strategy continue to hold the line, or will Russia develop new countermeasures that neutralize these tactics? One particularly remarkable engagement occurred near the contested town of Avdiivka, where a pair of Ukrainian F-16s intercepted a flight of Russian Su-35s, aircraft that, on paper, are theoretically superior in nearly every performance metric. The Su-35, Russia's most advanced operational fourth-generation fighter, boasts cutting-edge avionics, powerful thrust vectoring engines, and a longer-range radar system, making it a formidable opponent against any Western-built aircraft. However, what unfolded in the skies over Ukraine that day was a masterclass in tactical innovation, a testament to the adaptability and ingenuity of Ukrainian pilots who had spent years studying their adversaries' weaknesses. The Ukrainian pilots, many of whom had cut their teeth flying Soviet-era MiG-29s and Su-27s in the early days of the war, had an intimate understanding of Russian fighter doctrine. Unlike their Western counterparts, who often rely on beyond visual range missile engagements and electronic warfare superiority, Russian pilots are trained for aggressive close-quarters maneuvering. This was a fight Ukraine's airmen had spent their careers preparing for, and the arrival of the F-16, though older than the Su-35 in design, gave them a new tool with which to turn the tables. The encounter began when a Ukrainian reconnaissance drone detected multiple Russian Su-35s patrolling an area east of Avdiivka, likely on a combat air patrol mission to intercept Ukrainian strike aircraft. With little time to react, a pair of F-16s were scrambled from a forward airbase, racing to intercept the intruders before they could threaten friendly ground forces. The F-16s, though equipped with long-range AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles, were at an inherent disadvantage. The Su-35's Urbis-E radar system had a greater detection range, and the Russian fighters were likely carrying R-77 and R-37M air-to-air missiles, which had significantly longer reach than the F-16's standard armament. In a traditional head-to-head engagement, the Ukrainian pilots would have been engaged, and likely shot down, long before they got within firing range. But instead of attempting a conventional missile fight, the Ukrainians relied on deception. Knowing that the Su-35s would be scanning for targets at higher altitudes, the F-16 pilots flew at extremely low levels, hugging the terrain to minimize their radar cross-section. This tactic, known as terrain masking, allowed them to approach the Russian fighters undetected. At the last possible moment, they executed a rapid pop-up maneuver, appearing on the Su-35's radar screens in an instant, too close for the Russians to effectively use their long-range missiles. The Russian pilots, caught off guard by the sudden appearance of the F-16s, immediately maneuvered to engage. However, this was precisely what the Ukrainians had anticipated. Rather than relying on their speed advantage to escape, the F-16s deliberately lured the Su-35s into a turning fight at low altitude, where the battle would be decided by energy management, nose-pointing ability, and pilot skill rather than raw technological superiority. In this environment, the Su-35's thrust vectoring engines, typically an asset in high-altitude combat, became a liability. At lower altitudes, extreme maneuvering bleeds speed rapidly, and the Su-35, while powerful, had a larger airframe with higher drag. The F-16, by contrast, with its fly-by-wire digital flight controls and high thrust-to-weight ratio, excelled in sustained turns, allowing it to maintain energy and position itself for a shot. The lead Ukrainian pilot, recognizing an opening, performed a hard, descending brake turn to force his Su-35 opponent into an overshoot. At the same time, his wingman, trailing slightly behind, maintained a steady rate turn, positioning himself for an ideal shot. As expected, one of the Su-35 pilots overcommitted, attempting to force a kill by pulling into an extreme high-G turn. In doing so, he bled too much energy and found himself momentarily unable to maneuver. That moment was all the Ukrainian wingman needed. Within seconds, his radar locked onto the target. If this had been a live-fire engagement, he would have launched an AIM-120 AMRAAM, one of the most advanced air-to-air missiles in NATO's arsenal. The simulated shot was confirmed by the onboard systems, a clear indication that, had this been an actual combat encounter, the Su-35 would have been destroyed. Recognizing their vulnerability, the remaining Russian pilots immediately disengaged, using afterburners to climb and retreat, unwilling to risk further entanglement at close range. The Ukrainian pilots, aware that their aircraft lacked the fuel reserves to pursue, held their position briefly before breaking off and returning to base, their mission accomplished. Although no missiles were fired, the implications of this engagement were profound. The encounter demonstrated that, properly flown, the F-16 could hold its own against Russia's best fighters in visual range combat, a revelation that sent shockwaves through Russian aviation circles. Up until this point, the Russian Air Force had operated under the assumption that its technological advantages would allow it to dictate the pace and range of air combat engagements. However, Ukraine's aggressive and unconventional tactics shattered that belief, proving that the outcome of an aerial battle was not determined solely by the capabilities of the aircraft, but by the skill and adaptability of the pilots flying them. Word of the engagement quickly spread through intelligence channels, and Western analysts began reassessing the effectiveness of fourth-generation fighters in modern warfare. Many had previously considered the F-16 to be obsolete in contested airspace dominated by advanced air defense systems and fifth-generation fighters like the Su-57. However, the Ukrainian experience challenged those assumptions, showing that, under the right conditions, even an aging fourth-generation platform could be a formidable adversary. The incident also had major implications for Russian air strategy. In the days that followed, reports indicated that Russian Su-35 pilots had begun altering their combat air patrol routes, avoiding lower-altitude engagements where Ukrainian F-16s might have the advantage. Additionally, Russian commanders increased reliance on ground-based radar guidance, suggesting that the psychological impact of the encounter had forced a shift in operational tactics. For Ukraine, the victory, though only symbolic, was a major morale boost. It proved that superior training and innovative tactics could compensate for a technological gap, giving Ukrainian pilots the confidence to continue challenging Russian air superiority. More broadly, it validated NATO's decision to provide Ukraine with Western aircraft, reinforcing the argument that continued military support could tip the balance in the ongoing war. As the conflict evolved, the lessons learned from engagements like these would shape future air combat strategy, not just in Ukraine, but across the world. For military planners in Taiwan, South Korea, and Eastern Europe, the fight over Avdiivka was a case study in how to level the playing field against a numerically and technologically superior adversary. It also underscored a fundamental truth of aerial warfare. Technology alone does not win battles. It is the pilot, the strategy, and the willingness to adapt that ultimately determine victory or defeat. Ukraine's F-16 pilots had proven a point that many in the West had doubted, that in the hands of the right operators, even an aircraft designed in the 1970s could still challenge the world's most advanced fighters. The skies over Ukraine would never be the same again. Perhaps even more impressive has been the Ukrainian F-16's effectiveness against Russia's layered air defense systems, a development that has not only reshaped the air war over Ukraine, but also forced a strategic recalibration in Moscow. Initially, many analysts doubted that the F-16, despite its versatility, would be able to operate effectively in the heavily contested airspace dominated by Russia's formidable S-300 and S-400 missile systems. These advanced air defense platforms, designed to track and engage multiple targets at extreme ranges, were thought to impose near-total air denial over vast swathes of Ukrainian territory. However, Ukrainian pilots, working closely with NATO advisors and local engineers, quickly developed a highly effective suppression of enemy air defenses (CAD) strategy that combined their AGM-88 HARM missiles with indigenous drone reconnaissance assets in ways never before seen in modern aerial warfare. The key to Ukraine's success in penetrating Russia's air defenses has been the seamless integration of Western technology with Ukrainian battlefield ingenuity. Unlike traditional SEAD operations, which rely primarily on aircraft-mounted sensors and electronic warfare systems to detect and neutralize enemy radars, the Ukrainians have taken a more dynamic approach, using long-range reconnaissance drones as forward observers. These drones, often cheap and expendable, are flown deliberately into contested airspace, provoking Russian air defense operators into activating their radars. The moment a Russian system goes active, the drone transmits its location back to a waiting flight of F-16s, which immediately respond with a salvo of AGM-88 HARM missiles, designed specifically to home in on enemy radar emissions. One particularly devastating strike using this method occurred near Luhansk, where a Ukrainian drone successfully baited an S-400 battery into exposing its position. The S-400, Russia's most advanced long-range surface-to-air missile system, relies on a network of radars, including the powerful 91 N6E acquisition radar, which provides early warning and target tracking. The Ukrainian reconnaissance drone, flying at a medium altitude, suddenly triggered the activation of this radar as Russian operators prepared to engage what they believed to be a potential Ukrainian strike aircraft. As the radar locked onto the drone, the F-16 pilots, positioned at a safe distance, launched their harms from an oblique angle, an approach designed to minimize the missile system's reaction time. Within moments, the harms struck their target, destroying the 91N6E radar, rendering the entire S-400 battery combat ineffective and forcing Russian air defense operators to scramble for cover. The destruction of the Luhansk S-400 site sent shockwaves through the Russian military. Up until this point, Russian commanders had operated under the assumption that their most advanced air defense systems were impervious to Ukrainian countermeasures, capable of maintaining air denial indefinitely. The effectiveness of Ukraine's drone-assisted CAD strategy shattered that belief, proving that no Russian radar was truly safe from precision strikes. More alarmingly for the Kremlin, this was not an isolated incident. Satellite imagery soon confirmed that additional S-300 and S-400 batteries along the front lines were being gradually relocated westward, a clear sign that Russian forces were losing confidence in their ability to protect critical areas from Ukrainian airstrikes. The psychological impact of these operations on Russian forces has been profound. NATO intelligence analysts monitoring Russian radio communications have intercepted panicked transmissions from air defense operators, frantically calling for their radar systems to be shut down the moment an F-16 radar signature is detected. In multiple instances, Russian ground controllers have issued urgent warnings to their pilots, advising them to immediately disengage from combat zones where F-16s are suspected to be operating. This shift in behavior is particularly striking when contrasted with earlier phases of the war, when Russian pilots largely dismissed Ukrainian aircraft as minimal threats. Perhaps the most telling indicator of the growing fear of the F-16 within Russian ranks has been the change in Russian pilots' radio chatter. Ukrainian signals intelligence has intercepted an increasing number of uncensored Russian communications, in which fighter pilots openly express their concerns about engaging F-16s. In stark contrast to their previous confidence, Russian pilots are now heard discussing tactics to actively avoid direct engagements, often opting to retreat at the first sign of an F-16 presence rather than risk a confrontation. This represents a major psychological victory for Ukraine, as even the perception of F-16 dominance is now shaping Russian aerial strategy, forcing Russian pilots to operate more cautiously and limiting their ability to effectively support ground forces. Compounding Russia's troubles, the Ukrainian F-16's newfound ability to suppress air defenses has opened the door for expanded drone and strike aircraft operations. Previously, Ukrainian TB-2 Bayraktar drones and Soviet-era Su-34 bombers were limited in their operational range due to the constant threat posed by Russian SAM systems. However, with multiple S-300 and S-400 batteries now destroyed or withdrawn, Ukrainian forces have been able to resume deep strike missions with greater frequency, targeting Russian supply depots, command posts, and critical infrastructure far behind enemy lines. This shift has forced the Russian military to redistribute its remaining air defense assets, spreading them thinner across a larger area, making them even more vulnerable to future Ukrainian attacks. The success of Ukraine's F-16-led CAD strategy has not gone unnoticed by NATO military planners. In the wake of these engagements, reports have surfaced suggesting that U.S. Air Force and European defense officials are now studying Ukraine's tactics for possible incorporation into future Western CD doctrine. While the U.S. has traditionally relied on more advanced stealth platforms like the F-35 and F-22 to penetrate enemy airspace, Ukraine's ability to achieve similar results using legacy fourth-generation fighters combined with low-cost drones has provided valuable lessons for future conflicts. Military analysts have pointed out that this approach could be particularly relevant in potential future conflicts with China over Taiwan, where U.S. forces may need to operate in similarly dense air defense environments. For Russia, the implications of these developments are severe. The Kremlin had long touted its integrated air defense network as one of the strongest in the world, believing that it would provide an insurmountable barrier against NATO aircraft. Yet the battlefield in Ukraine has proven otherwise, with S-300 and S-400 systems repeatedly neutralized through a combination of superior tactics and technological adaptation. This reality is likely to cause long-term damage to Russian defense exports, as traditional buyers of Russian military hardware, including India, Algeria, and Vietnam, now have tangible proof that these systems can be countered effectively by even older Western aircraft. Ultimately, the F-16's arrival in Ukraine has triggered a paradigm shift in the aerial war, not just in terms of battlefield capabilities, but in the psychological balance of power. For the first time, Russian air forces are no longer operating with impunity, forced to second-guess every radar activation, every missile launch, and every sortie over contested territory. What began as a desperate gamble to modernize Ukraine's air force in the face of overwhelming Russian superiority has evolved into one of the most significant tactical revolutions of the war. As Ukrainian pilots continue refining their strategies and integrating more Western weapons into their arsenal, the skies over Eastern Europe may never be the same again. What was once considered a theater of absolute Russian dominance is now rapidly becoming a battleground of contested airspace, where old assumptions no longer apply and where the hunter has, in many cases, become the hunted. The jet's impact extends far beyond air-to-air combat. The arrival of Ukrainian F-16s has fundamentally transformed Kyiv's ability to conduct deep strike operations, giving its forces an unprecedented ability to disrupt Russian logistics, leadership structures, and high-value military installations. These aircraft, equipped with advanced sensor suites, targeting pods, and precision-guided munitions, have allowed Ukraine to extend its reach far beyond the front lines, delivering devastating blows to Russia's command structure and critical infrastructure. What had once been a war dominated by static artillery duels and drone skirmishes has evolved into a dynamic, high-intensity conflict in which Ukrainian pilots are reshaping the strategic landscape with every mission. One particularly devastating strike demonstrated the full potential of Ukraine's newly acquired aerial capabilities. A flight of 4 F-16s operating under the cover of darkness penetrated nearly 100 kilometers into Russian-controlled territory, flying at treetop level to evade enemy radar detection. Their target, a heavily fortified command post housing senior Wagner Group commanders, a location identified through a combination of signals intelligence, drone surveillance, and intercepted Russian communications. With absolute precision, the F-16 pilots deployed GPS-guided JDAM bombs, ensuring that their ordnance not only eliminated the high-value targets inside, but also collapsed the entire building, burying its occupants under tons of rubble. The sheer force of the explosions was so overwhelming that Russian rescue teams took nearly 48 hours to recover the bodies, a psychological blow that reverberated throughout Russia's mercenary forces. Reports from Russian mill bloggers and Wagner-affiliated Telegram channels described the aftermath in grim detail, noting that the strike had severely disrupted operational planning in the region. This mission, one of the deepest Ukrainian air raids into Russian-held territory, marked a significant turning point in Ukraine's ability to strike at the very heart of enemy command structures. The integration of JDAM precision-guided bombs, AGM-88 HARM anti-radiation missiles, and air-launched cruise missiles has further enhanced the effectiveness of the F-16s. Unlike the Soviet-era Su-24 and Su-25 attack aircraft that Ukraine had previously relied on, the F-16s can rapidly acquire, designate and engage targets with pinpoint accuracy, reducing the need for multiple strike attempts and minimizing exposure to enemy air defenses. Ukrainian pilots, many of whom cut their teeth flying MiG-29s and Su-27s, have adapted remarkably fast to the Western aircraft's advanced avionics and weapons systems, quickly mastering the intricacies of beyond visual range engagements and networked warfare. Their ability to seamlessly integrate Western weapons with Ukrainian battlefield tactics has left even seasoned NATO officers deeply impressed. But keeping these advanced aircraft operational under wartime conditions has presented a formidable logistical challenge. Unlike Western air forces, which rely on secure, high-tech maintenance facilities, Ukrainian ground crews have been forced to maintain their F-16s under relentless missile and drone attacks, often relocating maintenance hubs to concealed airstrips and highway runways to avoid detection. The constant threat of Russian Iskander and Caliber missile strikes has forced technicians to repair and refuel aircraft in record time, enabling them to launch multiple sorties per day despite having only a fraction of the resources available to their NATO counterparts. Ukrainian engineers have become masters of improvisation, developing creative solutions to maintain high mission-capable rates despite the scarcity of spare parts. With official supply chains often disrupted by Russian airstrikes, ground crews have resorted to cannibalizing parts from damaged aircraft, repurposing components from retired Western jets, and even manufacturing certain critical components locally. This remarkable adaptability has shattered initial Western doubts about Ukraine's ability to sustain F-16 operations over the long term. Some reports suggest that Ukrainian technicians have already developed 3D printing capabilities to produce minor replacement parts, reducing their dependence on foreign supply shipments. Western military advisors have openly admitted that the speed and efficiency with which Ukraine has kept its F-16s flying under extreme conditions far exceeds even the most optimistic expectations. The psychological impact of the F-16's battlefield presence has been profound. Russian pilots, once accustomed to dominating Ukrainian skies with superior aircraft and numbers, are now hesitant to engage whenever an F-16 is detected on radar. Radio intercepts have captured panicked Russian communications, with ground controllers urgently warning their pilots to avoid direct confrontations with the American-made fighters. In multiple instances, Russian Su-30 and Su-35 pilots have abandoned engagements altogether, choosing instead to retreat rather than risk a dogfight with Ukraine's new fleet. Even Russian S-300 and S-400 air defense crews have begun repositioning their systems further from the front lines, an implicit acknowledgement that Ukraine's SEAD, suppression of enemy air defenses, tactics have rendered these platforms increasingly vulnerable. The arrival of additional F-16 squadrons from European allies is set to further tip the balance in Ukraine's favor. While the initial batch of aircraft was focused primarily on defensive operations and limited strike missions, the next wave of deliveries will include F-16s armed with longer-range standoff weapons, including Storm Shadow and Scalp EG cruise missiles, which have already proven devastatingly effective when launched from Ukraine's Su-24 bombers. The integration of these weapons with F-16s will allow Ukraine to strike deep inside Russian-held territory with even greater precision and survivability, forcing Moscow to reallocate even more resources to air defense, resources it can ill afford to spare. Western military strategists have closely studied Ukraine's rapid adaptation to F-16 operations, with some arguing that the lessons learned in this conflict could reshape future NATO doctrine. In particular, the U.S. Air Force is reportedly analyzing Ukraine's drone-assisted CAD tactics, which have combined low-cost UAV reconnaissance with high-speed fighter jet strikes to systematically dismantle Russian radar networks. Some Pentagon officials have suggested that similar methods could be employed in potential future conflicts, including a hypothetical war in the Pacific, where the U.S. and its allies may have to contend with China's dense air defense systems. Russia, meanwhile, faces a growing strategic dilemma. The Kremlin had long boasted that its integrated air defense network was among the best in the world. Yet Ukraine's F-16s have repeatedly exploited its vulnerabilities, demonstrating that even fourth-generation Western aircraft can operate effectively in contested environments. This revelation is likely to undermine Russian arms exports, particularly to countries such as India, Algeria, and Vietnam, which have long relied on Russian-built air defense systems. If Ukraine's F-16s continue neutralizing S-300 and S-400 batteries with relative ease, Moscow's lucrative defense export industry could suffer irreversible damage. As the war progresses, the impact of the F-16 on Ukraine's battlefield capabilities will only grow. With each successful mission, Kyiv's ability to conduct deep strikes, suppress Russian air defenses, and maintain air superiority improves, further complicating Moscow's war effort. What began as a bold gamble to modernize Ukraine's air force amid a brutal conflict has turned into one of the most remarkable military adaptation stories in modern history. The combination of Western technology and Ukrainian battlefield ingenuity has not only redefined the aerial war over Ukraine, but has also set a precedent for future conflicts, proving that human adaptability can be just as decisive as technological superiority. In the months ahead, as more F-16s enter service and additional weapon systems are integrated, Ukraine's air campaign is expected to reach new levels of effectiveness. If Kyiv is eventually permitted to use these jets for long-range strikes inside Russia itself, the strategic calculus of the entire war could shift dramatically. One thing is certain: the F-16 has already changed the war in ways few could have predicted, and its impact will continue to shape the outcome of this conflict for the foreseeable future. The Ukrainian F-16 story has upended conventional wisdom about modern aerial warfare, proving that even non-stealth fourth-generation fighters can be highly effective in contested airspace when piloted with skill, determination, and tactical ingenuity. Before this conflict, most military analysts believed that traditional fighter jets, even those as versatile and capable as the F-16, would struggle to operate against advanced air defense systems and modern enemy aircraft without extensive support from fifth-generation stealth platforms like the F-35 or dedicated electronic warfare assets. However, Ukraine's highly trained pilots have shattered those assumptions, demonstrating that aerial dominance is not just about technology. It's about strategy, adaptation, and battlefield awareness. When the first F-16s arrived in Ukraine, many Western experts predicted they would be used cautiously, likely for standoff missile strikes from Ukrainian-controlled airspace, avoiding direct engagements with Russian aircraft and dense air defense networks. But Ukrainian pilots, many of whom had flown MiG-29s and Su-27s in the war's early days, quickly redefined how the F-16s would be used, employing a mix of old-school Soviet-style flying and NATO doctrine to maximize the jet's combat potential. Instead of high-altitude, risk-averse tactics, they pioneered low-altitude penetration missions, using terrain masking, electronic warfare, and drone reconnaissance to evade Russian radars and launch precise, unexpected attacks deep behind enemy lines. The results have been stunning. Ukrainian F-16s have destroyed key Russian air defense sites, including S-300 and S-400 batteries, using AGM-88 HARM missiles in coordination with Ukrainian-made drones that draw out enemy radar emissions. These aircraft have also conducted surgical strikes against high-value command centers, including a devastating raid on a Wagner Group headquarters that resulted in the deaths of senior Russian mercenary commanders. In several instances, Ukrainian F-16s have even engaged and outmaneuvered Russian Su-35s in dogfights, leveraging the F-16's superior agility, digital flight controls, and nose-pointing ability to force Russian pilots into disadvantageous positions. The psychological impact on Russian forces has been profound, with intercepted communications revealing growing anxiety among Russian pilots whenever F-16 radar signatures appear on their screens. On the ground, the morale boost provided by the F-16's arrival has been immeasurable. Ukrainian ground forces, long accustomed to operating under constant Russian air superiority, now fight with greater confidence, knowing that their own highly capable jets are providing close air support and hunting Russian attack aircraft. In contrast, Russian infantry, once emboldened by the assumption of total air dominance, now operate with increased caution, avoiding large troop concentrations for fear of being targeted by F-16s or their precision-guided munitions. The shift in air power dynamics has even forced Russian air defenses to relocate, pulling back their S-400 batteries farther from the front lines, reducing their effectiveness and creating new vulnerabilities in Russia's defensive network. One of the most remarkable aspects of Ukraine's F-16 operations has been the ingenuity of its ground crews and engineers, who have managed to keep these advanced aircraft operational under wartime conditions with limited resources. Unlike Western air forces, which rely on secure, high-tech maintenance facilities, Ukrainian crews have been forced to repair, rearm, and refuel their jets in makeshift, concealed airstrips to avoid Russian missile strikes. The constant threat of enemy attacks has turned every maintenance operation into a race against time. Yet despite these challenges, Ukraine has managed to maintain high sortie rates and aircraft availability. Ukrainian engineers have even found ways to manufacture replacement parts locally, salvage components from damaged aircraft, and integrate non-standard weapons onto F-16 platforms, ensuring that their air force remains combat-ready despite supply chain disruptions. The broader military implications of Ukraine's F-16 success are being closely studied by Western defense planners and air forces worldwide. The fact that a relatively small air force, operating with older non-stealth fighters, has managed to successfully counter Russia's sophisticated air defenses and aircraft has challenged existing doctrines and forced militaries across the world to rethink their reliance on stealth aircraft and long-range missile tactics. The U.S. Air Force and NATO are reportedly analyzing Ukraine's hybrid warfare tactics, particularly their innovative use of drones, electronic warfare, and terrain masking to penetrate heavily defended airspace. Some U.S. military strategists have suggested that these lessons could reshape future air combat doctrine, especially in potential conflicts in the Pacific, where China's extensive air defense networks could present similar challenges. Meanwhile, Russia finds itself in a growing dilemma. The Kremlin has long touted its air defense systems as the most advanced in the world, but the Ukrainian F-16s have repeatedly exposed weaknesses in Russian radar coverage, missile interception capabilities, and pilot training. As a result, Russian forces are being forced to reallocate air defense resources, further stretching an already overburdened military. The perception of Russian air superiority is crumbling, not only on the battlefield, but also among Russia's international arms customers, including India, Algeria, and Vietnam, who have traditionally relied on Russian-made fighter jets and missile systems. If the F-16s continue to neutralize Russian air defenses with relative ease, Moscow may suffer a long-term decline in military exports, further undermining its geopolitical influence. As Ukraine continues to receive more F-16s from European allies and its pilots grow even more proficient, the role of these aircraft in the war is expected to expand dramatically. Future operations could include long-range strikes on Russian military infrastructure deep inside occupied territories, coordinated assaults on key logistics hubs, and even missions targeting Russia's own air bases and supply routes inside its borders. Some analysts believe that if Western governments lift certain operational restrictions, Ukrainian F-16s could soon be launching precision strikes against high-value targets inside Russia itself, further complicating Moscow's strategic calculations. At this point, there is no doubt that the F-16 has fundamentally altered the course of the war, becoming a symbol of Ukraine's resilience, adaptability, and strategic ingenuity. What started as a bold gamble to modernize Ukraine's air force in the middle of a brutal conflict has evolved into one of the most compelling examples of rapid military adaptation in modern history. The combination of Western technology and Ukrainian innovation has created a highly lethal and effective aerial force, proving that in war, tactical creativity and determination can sometimes overcome even the most significant technological disadvantages. Looking ahead, the full impact of Ukraine's F-16s remains to be seen, but one thing is certain. These jets have already rewritten the rules of modern air combat. Whether through aggressive deep strike missions, innovative suppression of enemy air defenses, or direct aerial engagements with Russian fighters, the F-16s are reshaping the battlefield in ways few could have predicted. With every mission, Ukraine is proving that air superiority is not just about aircraft specifications, strategy, and sheer determination of those who fly them.